Well, we'd like to welcome you all to another Sunday afternoon class from the BYU Library Family History Center. We're going to be talking about finding your ancestors in the Philippines. So we'll get right into this. This is a new innovation that I've decided to put into my presentations, and I'd appreciate any comments about whether you think it's good or bad. But basically, this is what I think is going to help a lot. Reminding that this presentation is posted on the BYU Library Family History Center YouTube channel and the website. And usually there's a copy of the slides as a handout on the website. As I went through and reviewed today, it turns out that there's an entire transcript of the program on YouTube. But there's usually a question about the links in a handout. And so what I've decided to do is that all the links in the presentation will have a text link, which is, written text on the screen, and a QR code. So if you're listening and you want to look quickly at the slide, you can simply use your smartphone, iPhone or other phone to look at this QR code, and that'll take you to the websites that I've cited. So I thought it would be easier for people, instead of trying to copy the URL codes, the text codes to or addresses to the websites, to have the QR codes. So all of these should have a QR code. Here's the key, and it's going to be the key to almost any research that you're doing in genealogy around the world, or whatever it is that you're involved in looking for your ancestors and relatives. To begin looking for the records of your ancestors' lives, you need to know some exact locations in your ancestors' lives. The first thing you're going to need to be aware of is, where did the things happen? So if you were to come into the library and start asking me questions and saying something like, I hear constantly, I am trying to find my, you can fill in the blank, great-grandfather, and start telling me about your great-grandfather. This is what I commonly hear. Then the first question I have back is, maybe not always in this order, but what time period are we talking about? Is he, in the 1800s? Are we going further back than that? Are we current? Is he alive now? Whatever. And then the next question is, where are these things taking place? Where did he live? Where did he die? Where are we going to have to start looking? So those are the two key things that help us to focus in on where and when records would have been available around the world. Now, I'm giving this introduction for the Philippines because, as you'll see in just a few minutes here, talking about the location can be fairly complicated. Let's call it as complicated as any country I have yet encountered. What is important is to start your genealogical research in the Philippines or in any place by contacting the members of your family and ask for letters, photos, documents, certificates, anything they have that tangible that you might be able to have. Now, sometimes the relatives don't want to part from these. Sometimes they're more than happy to have you take these things off their hands. But in either case, it's a good idea to immediately, as soon as possible, begin the process of digitizing those documents so that they can be preserved. And the easiest way today to do that is on a smartphone. Any of the brands of the smartphone today, iPhone, Samsung, whatever, are perfectly capable of taking good photos, good images of the documents and other photos. So those are some good ways to get started. And it's also, when you work in a different country's records, to recognize that each of the historical background of the country has been one that is different than any other country, and the languages are generally different. And in the Philippines, we have a lot of that. In other words, we have a lot of geographically important places where there's going to be different ways of keeping the records in some cases, and also physically the country is very varied from the ocean up to high mountains. In addition to that, we need to have the historical so we can begin to understand the kinds of records that may have existed in the past. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, there are a whole industry in the past, and also still in some places around the world, of maintaining and keeping horses for transportation purposes. And so there's lots of people that the records of all that is something that would not exist so much today, and maybe in some areas is still being kept, but not in the same way it was previously. So time can affect what kinds of records are kept. And it's important to understand also that all the valuable genealogical records were kept at or near the places where the events occurred in your ancestors' lives. Let's translate that into English. Where you were born, birth records are going to be made at or near the time of the birth. That means that somebody had to be there to record the birth. Obviously, the mother, perhaps a near relative, and in many cases, beginning at some point in time in most of the countries of the world, births began to be recorded either by the church or by the government or in some other ways. But those records originated around the place where the event occurred. Now, over time, those records could have been moved hundreds, even thousands of miles away from where the original record was created. But the way that the records are kept on a general way, almost uniformly across the world, is organized by the places where the events occurred. So if you want to look for a record in the Philippines on one of the islands, you're going to have to go to that island to begin the search for the records. They may have been transported to some central repositories, a government archive or a library or whatever. But beginning the process, you need to know what records were available and created near the place of the events. So why am I emphasizing this? Well, particularly in a place like the Philippines, it's going to be important, and we'll get to that just in a couple of minutes. Another thing that's important to focus on is the language of whatever ancestral family you have. And there are over 170 languages in the Philippines. And there's different language families. Now, what does that mean? It means that sometimes within a language family, the languages are mutually sort of understandable. So if you happen to speak a language, like if you were from Sweden and you were speaking Swedish and you were talking to somebody who spoke Danish, a lot of what you said would be understandable. If you were speaking Spanish and someone else was speaking Portuguese, they're the same family of languages, and they're mutually sort of conversationally possible. I've been able to communicate with people from my Spanish to their Portuguese on occasion when it was necessary, and we can pretty well get along. If they're not in the same language family, then there are nothing in common between the languages. Maybe loaned in words, some adopted words might be the same. A lot of computer terms, for example, today are similar in a lot of different languages, even if they aren't mutually understandable. And the one thing that's important is that there are two kinds of languages, at least in the Philippines. And whether or not the people who speak those languages can understand the languages depends on the exact languages. So in this country, in using research in the Philippines, it's very important to identify the language originally spoken by your ancestors so that you can begin to focus on records that may have been kept in that language. Now, there may be another possibility, and that's that there are official languages. And even though there's in the graphic it said 170, well, that was a good guess in between 120 and 187. The difference here is what is determined, what people call a dialect or a language. A dialect, for instance, if it's English, it would be a dialect would be a language like that spoken in the South as opposed to in the North, a part of the United States, or the difference between language in England and of English in England and English in California, for example. There may be as many as 182 native languages now. Not all of these languages are currently used. In other words, there's some of them may have only a very, very, very small number of native speakers, whereas English and Tagalog are the official languages. And those are languages that are generally spoken throughout all of the country. And usually in a country where there are official languages, the main governmental record sets are kept in those languages. But if you're working with individual families, you want to be aware of letters and other correspondence, and all of those may be in the native language of the people. And even though they may be extremely valuable, they're not as easily translated, for example, as English and Tagalog. So this is part of the process of doing the research. And it's important in a country like the Philippines to recognize that. And here is a map, a graphic map of the linguistic heritage. In other words, all those little colors and dots and things are all those different languages that are spoken in the Philippines. So you can move maybe just a few miles in some areas and go from one language to another that was predominant. Now, in a country like, for example, in the United States, we do have lots and lots of languages spoken, and it's not unusual with us, with my wife and I, as we work at Brigham Young University, to hear people speaking other languages around because a lot of people come from around the world to go to the Brigham Young University. And so it's possible that there's languages that were spoken. And you even have the large cities. When they go to the large cities, generally speaking, the languages begin to change and the people have a tendency to adopt the predominant language of the city. Why do we worry about that? Well, that's once again, we go back to the records and the way that the information has been kept so that we can basically understand the way our ancestors were speaking. When some of us, like my ancestry coming from Europe, I have two or three different languages. And in the British Isles, there's Irish and Scottish and English and Welsh and all sorts of other dialects of things across Great Britain. This is the form. I hear this long group of islands that stretches for great distance across the ocean is referred to as an archipelago or an archipelago. And the Philippines has 7,641 islands, and there are three major island groups. There's the Luzon, and there's the Visayas, and the Mindanao. This is why I say this, only about 2,000 islands are inhabitable, and so are inhabited. So imagine how many different places that your ancestors could come from any one of those 2,000 islands. And the difference between that and what the differences may be linguistic. In other words, They may be speaking a language that's different than the surrounding islands or even different from any of the other any place else in the Philippines. And in addition to that, there are those 5,000 extra islands that haven't really been named or observed as islands. So the nature of this country is the geographic nature of this country is complex. And it's not as easy as saying people from the north and the south and the east and the west, because the difference in just in the directions does not reflect the same linguistic diversity. And the languages spoken in the North Island are entirely different than those spoken in the South Island, except for the predominant English and Spanish languages and Tagalog. We'll get into when the Spanish were in the Philippines. So yes, there's a residual amount of Spanish in the Philippines language. And when I listen to people talk in either English or Tagalog from the Philippines, I often detect that some of the words they use and some of the language they use is partially Spanish. And then there are those who do speak Spanish. So that's another issue. So this is what happens when you have that many islands and the population, a substantially large population. Basically, you have a lot of jurisdictional subdivisions. That means that each jurisdiction is an area that we think of that has the same law and the same type of records that are being kept. So they can vary from region to region throughout the country in different ways. If you want an example from the United States, if you have a county in Arizona and another county in Texas and a county in New York State, you're going to find there are significant differences in the way the records are kept, maintained, and even the content of the records is going to vary from county to county. There's no uniform county way of doing it, of keeping the records. In fact, the laws are substantially different from state to state in the United States. And that is the same situation that is existing here in the Philippines. As you go across the provinces, you end up with different variations in different ways. So that the way that you find and are able to use records may be very much determined by where it was kept originally. So there are 18 regions, and they're grouped into the island groups. And then regions are divided into 82 provinces, and these are subdivided into cities, municipalities, and finally 42,011 barangays. Barangays is the way I would say that. I hope that's somewhat like it would be. And we don't have a translation into English for that. So that's just what it is. And I find that the case, as a matter of fact, there are Danish jurisdictions for which there are no English translations. And there's the same thing in other countries that I've encountered. And so then there are some what are usually called capital or autonomous regions, which are ones that have their own individual government that are not part of any province or anything. You may think that's kind of unusual, but if you thought about it, you'd realize that in the United States, there are lots of autonomous cities like St. Louis, Missouri, for example. And there are in other countries, this is not uncommon, that the city itself will become its own province or whatever you want to call it. And they're usually called autonomous regions. In the United States, we have a very, very, very prominent one, and that's Washington, District of Columbia, which is not part of any state or county outside. So here we have another, what I would say, significant challenge here with having so many different jurisdictional subdivisions, as well as the language and the geographic spread. But just in case, this is the definition. And a barangay is a small territorial and administrative district forming the most local level of government. I just might note that when I say things, I automatically say them in Spanish. But so if it sounds like I'm speaking Spanish, that's what's happened because that's my other, I guess you would call it native language. So what happened is that great in the past, early years, the Philippines was all a network that reflected all of the languages. And they were actually these sophisticated barangays and sultanates, meaning they were under the direction of a king or like a kingling kind of person, a sultan. And there was a lot of trade going on between these. And the trade and all of this history of the islands and the commerce between them was what eventually ended up in having a cohesive government, a national government for all of these many separate islands. So the reason why Spanish is still spoken and why it has such a great influence on a lot of the culture and the language in the Philippines is the Spanish colonial period, which stretched from 1521 to 1898. And basically, the religion, the established religion, became Catholicism, and it was central via the galleon trade. Now, what you call the galleon trade is that like that ship that's kind of here in this illustration. The galleons were the what the Spanish used to get trade. Now, being part of the Spanish Empire was not overly beneficial to the individual country that was occupied by the Spanish Empire. Spain had a tendency over its hundreds of years of existence as an empire to siphon out most of the let's call it the gold and valuables out of the islands and take them into Spain, which of course made Spain even more prominent and more important in Europe. And that was the history. So there was a large reason by the early 1800s and into the mid and end of the 1800s that the individual countries across the world that were once part of the Spanish Empire began to exercise their sovereignty in the form of revolutions and other ways of taking care of the Catholic. The issue here was that the empire went, but the Catholic Church did not leave. And so, in many, or if not most of all of the former Spanish Empire countries, they're still predominantly Catholic. And in 1898, the Americans came in and took over the Philippine government and ran the government until 1946, which was almost right to the end of, that was right at the end of World War II. So after World War II, there was a time during the American rule that things like self-governance and public education were introduced, but that was all interrupted by World War II. And it was, there was a separation, and the United States was no longer, American was no longer in control of the Philippines. After 1946, when independence was led by Ferdinand Marcos, and he imposed martial law, and that lasted until around 1986 when there was what's called the People Power Revolution occurred, and a democratic government was founded. So there's still challenges in the government and economic development, but the Philippines has become a major commercial, and they're a major player in the international world today. So it's a very vibrant and growing country also. Okay, now back to records. So once you've gone through this process of learning about the country, about the records, and about your family, and learning to the extent where you can find some of the records of your family from them, from your family directly, then it's ready for you to do some research. You can move from there into the kinds of things that you want to find. So here's the kind of the challenges inherent, which I've referred to already in pretty much in some detail. The Philippine research has been historically dependent on the church records because of the centralization was so difficult. Think about it. It's taken until modern times, meaning post in the mid 1900s, that transportation and communication became even realistically possible between all these many islands. And the fragmentation was difficult to establish any consistent record keeping in a lot of areas. So when this happens, what we need to depend upon is ability of the countries to begin the digitization process. In other words, not just confining digitization to the government records, but also to any other records which could be made available or which were possible. And that's an ongoing project that's going on with the Philippines and with a lot of other countries in the world. There are countries where a vast majority of the records are digitized and available. To mentioning a couple, that would be the Scandinavian countries and to some extent Great Britain. But on the other hand, even in the United States, it's been only very recently, in the last 100 years or so, that the United States has had anything approaching records being kept uniformly. So this is going to be one of the other major challenges. And it's a challenge in the United States, but it's even a greater challenge because of the numbers and the geographic diversity in a country like the Philippines. That does not mean it's not possible. It just means that becomes more difficult, and it means you need to spend more time learning about the records and learning about the history so that you can determine where those records may have been kept and how they would be kept. So if you want kind of a what I might call an analogous situation. If you think about the United States, you'd think, well, yeah, we've got a lot of records and they're available and wherever. Records are kept on the county level for many things, like, for instance, marriage records, but birth and death records since the mid 1900s have been only kept at the state level. Previous to that, they could be practically anywhere or non-existent. So the time periods, as well as the geographic diversity, are important. So here's kind of where the records went in this chart in the different time periods from the pre-1930s colonial era up through the current access today. So you'll see as we go along that the church records, primarily of the Catholic Church, are the ones up to around the mid 1930s that are going to be the records that are becoming the most usable, and let's call it available and usable, like accessible. And then from the 1930s to 1945, they began civil registration. Civil registration is something that exists in most of the countries of the world today, notably not in the United States. We do not have civil registration, uniform registration from the government. It's been a lot of times proposed, but it's never caught on. So your registration of your, for instance, your ID card that you would carry or the documents you carry to show that you are a citizen of the country. With civil registration, that's national. That's a national. They're made. The records are made at the local level, but they're nationally available to the population. So you can travel anywhere in the country, and you need to have a civil registration card to do just about anything. But in the United States, what happened, what is taken over from that is our driver's licenses. So everyone in the country, or most of the predominantly people have a driver's license. In the United States, we also rely on our own on other records, and depending on different jurisdictions. So this is not it's not unusual, and this is because of the history in the Philippines with the Spanish Empire and the Catholic Church. This is pretty much the same format of the records and the types of records that would be available throughout, say, Latin America and Spain and the southern parts of the Catholic parts of Europe. Civil registration records owe their origins back to Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte, when he began the French conquest of most of the western part of Europe, basically imposed civil registration, and the countries decided it was a good idea, and even countries outside of Napoleon's conquest began to adopt civil registration. And they usually began the adoption in the 1800s, but the Philippines is a little bit later than that. And you can see today one of the major primary access points for the records are the family is FamilySearch.org itself. That's where probably one of the better places, if not the best place now to begin research. But in addition to that, there's others, and some of which are quite unusual, like the Hati Trust. You wouldn't know that was may not even be aware of it as a website, but it's a huge repository of records, mainly from universities across the United States. But they have major records. Now we're going to talk a lot now about the record sets and things that are available today. So here's where we would start. For example, if we're looking at records, is the FamilySearch Research Wiki. The wiki is it's part of the FamilySearch.org website. It's under the search tab there at the top, and it's called the Research Wiki. The Research Wiki's present status is a little bit unclear. It started out as a regular wiki like Wikipedia and many other wikis out there, where they're user contributed and user controlled. And to some extent, when it was introduced years ago, the Research Wiki was that form of record. But beginning about a year and a half ago in July of 2024, the wiki was made internal. In other words, there are no external contributors now to the Research Wiki, at least that we are aware of. And that means that all of the control and the status of the records has been internalized into FamilySearch.org. But even given there's facts that there's no longer any outside contribution, the records are extremely useful and is a tremendously good place to come to find and read and understand all the different record sets, where they might be found, how they might be located, and what is currently available on FamilySearch. Now, where the wiki may not be completely up to date is because I don't think anybody could be completely up to date. And that is that FamilySearch is in the process of acquiring records constantly into the millions and millions of records every year. And so the number of records from any given location could be, and the types of records available could be different. There's other places on the FamilySearch website where you can find all the records. And recently, the FamilySearch the last 2 years, the FamilySearch website has been converting all of the records using handwriting recognition and computer-aided indexing, so that all of the words, full text words of the documents, can be searched and researched. This is going to change, but additionally, you really need to begin here at the free FamilySearch website. To gain complete access to the records, you're going to find out very quickly if you start to use the website. You need to be registered, and that's all really the prerequisite to using the records on the website. There are a significant number of records because of the time when the United States was, they call it, in control of the Philippines. A lot of the records were created by the United States, and they ended up in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And this is the Philippine Archives collection, and it's considered to be one of the major collections. That's the good news. The bad news is that the archives are primarily not digitized and readily available. And sometimes it's almost necessary, or it becomes necessary on occasion to physically go to the National Archives to do research. So this may not be the most open records, but there are ongoing digitization projects by the National Archives, and you're best to be served to check all the major genealogical websites out there, like FamilySearch and Ancestry and MyHeritage, at least those three, to see if any additional records may have been added to the collections from available records in the Philippines. So going back to the research wiki, not only does the wiki contain a lot of historical information and other things, but what is available here is a long list of the types of records. So you can pretty well get an idea of the types of records over there on the left that are all the ones in blue are records that FamilySearch has at least some of. It may have more or less than those. And I would point out that the church records and the civil registration records, of course, are the most important, but notarial records are traditionally important. And in some cases, such as in Mexico, the notarial records have now been substantially digitized and are available on FamilySearch. It is possible that they could obtain those records, but you understand, and I understand the challenge of getting records that are uniformly available across all of the different islands and jurisdictions in the Philippines. And as I mentioned, the FamilySearch is the one with the largest collections of Philippine records. And with the advent of full text search, they're becoming more and more available. Now, civil registration records are interesting from the standpoint of what's happened in the Philippines. These are birth records, marriage and death certificates and records, and you can request these online from the Philippine Statistics Authority, which is the PSA. And there's this website like the PSA Servilis. Now, one of the reasons I think these big websites, and this is my opinion, but I'm pretty sure that's probably the reason, is because the Philippines, over at least the most recent years, since in the 1900s, has had a tremendous, let's say, international impact through Filipinos working in various countries of the world. So it's not unusual to find Philippine communities in a lot of the European countries and the United States and even into Latin America and other places and the Far Eastern countries in lots of different countries. So basically, from this reason alone, I think that these records are generally made available, the civil registration records, through this website. It may not be as easy as it may seem just to get the records. There may be some procedures that need to be done before you can obtain the records, but it's apparently, from what the literature on it says, is that you can get a record from this directly from almost anywhere in the world. The next big one is the National Archives of the Philippines. And like any of these countries, a lot of countries of the world have had different times in their history when they were in favor of and not in favor of, or not supporting, actively supporting the archives of their country. And that also includes the United States. We have some sort of what you would call tragic occurrences in the United States, like the loss of the entire 1890 census due to blamed on a fire, but really due to bureaucratic negligence. And so none of the countries of the world probably have a uniformly way of keeping records, and so from time to time. But of course, the big challenges with the Philippines. But I think even in that event, has been a substantial effort to get records. Like many archives, some of those records may only be available to people who come to the archives themselves to use the records, and the digitizing of the records may be not as complete as we would like. There's a website out there that has a substantial number of Filipino records, and that's called Filipino Genealogy Research Basics. And this is a valuable website for anyone beginning research directly into the Philippines. Now, one of the other issues that I found as I did research, and because of what I've done in all the other countries that I've researched in, is that there's not a lot of records in other countries of the Philippine records. So, for example, here in the United States, we have, with the exception of the FamilySearch records that are available for the Philippines, there's not really a lot of other records available out in different states or whatever. And the same in many other countries. So research for Philippine records is going to have to be primarily aimed at those repositories and websites and things that have maintained the records over the years. What I think that what I'm trying to say with that is to put it into something that sounds reasonable. You're not going to find a whole lot of Philippine records on Ancestry and MyHeritage. Let's just put it this way. That's kind of what I was alluding to. This is probably and I mentioned right at the beginning, this is the one of the most amazing things that I've seen. And along with the civil registration records, I think it's something that I wish they had. Every single country had this. Our lives as genealogists would be so much better. This is the Catholic Records ph. And Catholic Records ph. You can request baptismal confirmation, communion, matrimony, and death certificates. And death certificates are unusual for the Catholic Church. It's usually burial records online through the website. Now, if you were in the Philippines, you can get that delivered to you. But I'm not sure what it doesn't say really explain what happens if you're outside of the country. But this is something that's definitely you want to learn about. And for anybody who has relatives in the Philippines, then your relatives should be able to get these records and get them to you. I mean, I thought that was just amazing because the difficulty of getting Catholic records in Latin America is sometimes overwhelming because the records are kept in each individual parish, which is a small geographic area, and the diocese, which are the larger areas. There is another one that's by what's called the Ayala Foundation, and it is has the Filipinas Heritage Library, and this is another major repositories. You can see some numbers down at the bottom of photographs and physical books and other things that are and digital objects that they have available. So when you're getting into this, the first thing that you want to do is to keep learning. And as you learn more and more about the country and the records that are available, you're then still confronted with the diversity in the languages spoken and all of the others. But each of those is going to take the time to learn and understand and basically begin to accumulate your genealogical information.